Leif gripped the tiller. The wood was slick with salt spray. His knuckles were white. For 30 days, the sea had been a gray, heaving monster. The single sail of his nar, a square of stained wool, strained against the wind. It was the year 874. They were far from the coast of Norway, searching for the new land that Gunnbjorn Ulfson had seen. Hope was a dwindling resource. Food was not. Stacked in the open hold of the ship were hundreds, maybe thousands, of dried cod. They called it screed, stockfish. Back in the Lofoten Islands, they had hung the fish on huge wooden racks. The winter winds, cold and relentless, had wicked every drop of moisture from the flesh. The fish became as hard as wood. Each one weighed about a fifth of its original weight. A single fish, once rehydrated by chewing or soaking, could feed a man for a day. But they had loaded the nar with enough to last the 30-man crew for more than a year. This was their currency of survival. It did not rot. It was pure protein, a block of fuel for the human body. When a storm raged for a week and they could not light a fire on their small stone hearth box, they chewed on chunks of the hard fish. It was a jaw-aching task, but it kept them alive. When the seas were calm, they would smash a fish with a mallet, soak the pieces in a bucket of precious fresh water, and boil it into a simple, nourishing porridge. Leif looked at the men. Their faces were chapped by the wind and salt. Their beards were tangled. But their bodies were strong. They were not starving. He knew sagas of other crews less prepared who had been becalmed for weeks. They had eaten their leather shoes. They had starved. His grandfather had told him that the sea does not kill you with water. It kills you with hunger. The stockfish was their shield against that kind of death. It was the reason they could dare to cross the vast, unknown ocean. It was not just food, it was the technology that powered their age of exploration. Without those hard, tasteless planks of dried fish, there would be no voyage to Iceland. No settlement in Greenland, no new world to find. It was life itself, cured by the wind. Number 10, drying is the oldest trick in the book. Jens felt the familiar ache in his lower back. He was 16 years old, but his body felt much older. It was the summer of 1365 in Bergen, Norway. He stood on the bryggen, the long wooden wharf that was the heart of the city. All around him was the sound of commerce. German, the language of the Hanseatic League merchants, was spoken more than Norse. Jens did not work for the Germans. He worked for his father, who worked for his father before him, all of them fishermen beholden to the League. His job was simple and brutal. He unloaded cod, not fresh cod, but the rock-hard, wind-dried stockfish that was Norway's gold. The fishing boats, small and sturdy, would return from the Lofoten Islands hundreds of miles to the north. Their holds were filled with the product of the winter's catch. From January to April, the men had fished for the skrei, the migrating Arctic cod. They had gutted them, tied them in pairs by the tail, and hung them on vast wooden racks called gel. Jens had been there once as a boy. He remembered the sight of millions of fish hanging against the sky. The process required no salt, no fire, no special tools, just the cod and the cold, dry winter. The temperature had to be just right, hovering around freezing. If it was too warm, bacteria would spoil the fish. If it was too cold, the water in the flesh would freeze, creating ice crystals that ruined the texture. The winds did all the work. For 3 months, the fish hung, losing nearly 80% of their weight until they were like wooden clubs. Now, in Bergen, it was Jens's job to move these fish clubs from the boats to the warehouses. The German merchants, with their fine wool coats and leather ledgers, watched from the doorways of their offices. They controlled everything. They set the price. They owned the warehouses. They had the ships to carry the stockfish to the markets of England, Germany, and beyond. A German clerk, no older than Jens, tallied the bundles. Each bundle was a specific weight. The Germans were very precise. And Hens and the other boys would form a line. A bundle of fish, maybe 20 or 30 of them tied together, would be thrown onto his shoulder. The dried tails and fins would scratch his neck. He would walk, half running, down the creaking wooden planks of the wharf to the correct warehouse. The smell was everywhere. It was not the smell of rot, but a dry, dusty, deeply fishy odor that clung to his clothes, his hair, his skin. He did not notice anymore. Inside the warehouse, the stockfish was stacked to the ceiling. It was currency. The Hanseatic merchants would trade it for grain from the Baltic, for cloth from Flanders, for wine from France. Norway had poor soil. It could not grow enough grain to feed its people. Without the stockfish trade, they would starve. It was that simple. Jens's family ate fish and a little bit of rye porridge. The bread they saw the Germans eating was a luxury. His father had told him stories. In the old days, before the League's complete control, a fisherman could trade his own fish. Now, they were in debt to the merchants. The merchants advanced them supplies for the fishing season flour, salt for personal use, hooks, lines. At the end of the season, the value of the stockfish was calculated against the debt. There was rarely anything left over. One day, a German merchant named Herr Schmidt stopped Jens. He was a portly man with a red face. He pointed at a pile of fish. "This one," he said in broken Norse. "It is wet." A small section of the pile had been exposed to a leak in the roof. A few of the fish had absorbed moisture. They were no longer perfectly preserved. They were ruined. Herr Schmidt made a note in his ledger. The value of that bundle would be deducted from the fisherman's total. It was a disaster for that family. A week's worth of food gone because of a few drops of water. The dried fish could last for years. Jens had seen stockfish in the back of a warehouse that was said to be a decade old. It was still edible. Sailors took it on long voyages. Armies used it as rations. During famines, it was the food of last resort. To prepare it, you had to rehydrate it. The most common way was to beat it with a mallet to break up the fibers, then soak it in water for days, changing the water frequently. Then it could be boiled or baked. Sometimes it was soaked in a lye solution, a process that created lutefisk. Jens did not care for lutefisk. It was gelatinous and strange. He finished his shift as the sun began to set. While his shoulders burned, his hands were covered in small cuts from the sharp fins. He was paid not in coin, but with a small portion of second-grade stockfish. A fish that was too small or slightly broken. It was enough to feed his family. He walked home, the bundle of hard fish under his arm. This was his life, unloading the food that fed Europe and giving just enough of the scraps to survive until the next day. The entire economy, the lives of everyone in the city rested on those dried, hard bodies of cod, preserved by nothing more than the winter wind. Number 9. Salt drew a line between plenty and starvation. Thomas Pike wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a hand covered in fish, scales, and coarse salt. The year was 1585. He was not in his home village near Bristol, England. He was thousands of miles away on the rocky coast of a place they called Newfoundland. He was a splitter. It was a vital, respected, and filthy job. He stood at a long wooden table under a crude shelter of pine boughs. The table was slick with fish guts and blood. Before him lay a cod nearly as long as his arm. With a swift, practiced motion, he slit the fish's belly from throat to tail. He reached in, ripped out the liver, and tossed it into a barrel. The liver would be rendered for oil used in lamps back home. Then he pulled out the guts and threw them to the gulls, screaming overhead. With another cut, he removed the head. Finally, and this was the most important cut, he sliced along the backbone, laying the fish open like a book. He cut out the top part of the spine, leaving the tail intact. The fish was now a flat, white canvas of flesh. He slid it down the table to the next man. The whole process took less than 30 seconds. He would do this thousands of times a day. He was part of a fishing station, a temporary village that existed only for the summer season. His ship, the Good Hope, had arrived in May after a harrowing 6-week voyage across the Atlantic. They had found a sheltered cove and built their station. There was the stage, a wharf built out over the water where the small fishing boats, the shallops, would unload their catch. There were the flakes, vast wooden racks for drying the fish, and there were the salt houses. The man next to Thomas was the salter. He was the most important man on the crew after the captain. He took the split fish and laid it in a great pile, alternating layers of fish and salt. Of course, grey salt, brought all the way from Portugal. The ship had carried 40 tons of it in its hold, more valuable than the men themselves. The salt was the key. It drew the water out of the fish's flesh, creating an environment where bacteria could not grow. This was the wick cure. The fish would sit in the salt pile, pressing down on each other for weeks. The brine created would drain away. Thomas knew the difference between a good salter and a bad one. Too little salt, and the fish would spoil on the voyage home. Too much, and it would be too salty to sell, and it would burn the fish, making it hard and useless. The salter, a man named William, had an instinct for it. He knew how much salt to use based on the size of the fish and the humidity of the day. Life was a relentless rhythm of work. Before dawn, the fishing crews would row their shallops out to the fishing grounds, the Grand Banks. They would spend the day hand-lining for cod. They would return in the afternoon, their boats laden with fish. And then Thomas and the shore crew would work late into the night, processing the catch by the light of fish oil lamps. They ate cod, boiled cod, fried cod, cod chowder, and hardtack, a biscuit so hard you had to soak it in water to eat it. This industry was feeding a growing Europe. England's population was rising. The fields at home could not feed everyone. Well, salted cod was cheap protein. It was the food of the Navy, the armies, and the common people. The Catholic countries of Europe, with their meatless Fridays and Lenten season, created a massive guaranteed market. This fish, caught off a distant, wild coast, was a matter of national security and economic power for England. One day, a shallop came back early. One of the fishermen, a young boy named John, had gashed his leg badly with a fishing knife. The wound was deep. The captain cleaned it as best he could with rum, but within 2 days it was infected. The leg swelled and turned dark. There was no doctor. They knew what was coming. The boy grew feverish. He died 3 days later. They buried him in the thin soil behind the beach with a simple wooden cross. There were dozens of such graves scattered along the coast. Men died from accidents, from sickness, from drowning. The work was dangerous. The reward was small. A season's share might be enough to feed a man's family through the winter. After the salting, the fish was washed and taken to the flakes to dry in the sun and wind. This was the final step. The men had to be vigilant. They had to turn the fish regularly. They had to cover them with canvas if it rained. A single downpour could ruin a month's work. In late August, they loaded the ship. The hold was filled with the dried, salted cod. It was hard and stiff, had a clean, salty smell. They had processed over 200,000 fish. It was a fortune. They set sail for the port of Bilbao in Spain. The captain would sell the fish there, buy Spanish wine and iron, and sail back to Bristol. The profits would be huge. Thomas Pike would get a small share. He looked back at the Newfoundland coast as it disappeared over the horizon. It was a brutal, unforgiving place, but the salt had allowed them to conquer it. It turned a perishable fish from a distant ocean into a stable commodity, a food that could cross seas and feed nations. It was a simple mineral, but it was the foundation of an empire built on cod. Number 8, smoke carried the story of the salmon. Alara was not her real name. It is a name we use because her own is lost to us. She lived around the year 1750 in a village on the bank of a river that would one day be called the Fraser in what would become British Columbia. Her people were the Stolo, the people of the river. The river was their entire world, and the heart of the river was the salmon. In late summer, the world turned red. The sockeye salmon returned from the great saltwater. Their bodies changed from silver to a brilliant crimson. They fought their way up the river, driven by an instinct to return to the streams where they were born. For Alara and her people, this was the season of immense work and profound gratitude. The survival of her family through the long, wet winter depended entirely on these few weeks. Alara, who was about 30, was a master at processing the fish. Her hands, strong and calloused, moved with an economy of motion that had been passed down through countless generations of women. Her husband and brothers would catch the salmon using weirs and dip nets. They would bring the fish to the shore, hundreds of them in a single day. Alara and the other women took over from there. She used a knife made from slate sharpened to a razor's edge. With a few quick cuts, she would gut the fish and remove the head. She did not waste the head. It would be boiled for a rich soup. Then she would butterfly the salmon, slicing it down to the tail, but leaving the skin intact, so it would hang open. She made a series of parallel cuts into the thick flesh, not going all the way through the skin. These cuts would help the smoke penetrate and the fish to dry evenly. The cleaned and scored salmon were then hung on long poles. These poles were hoisted up into the rafters of the longhouse, a massive structure made of cedar planks that housed several families. In the center of the longhouse, fires were kept smoldering day and night, but these were not cooking fires. They were smoke fires. The women in charge of the fires used specific woods. Alder and maple were preferred. They produced a cool, dense smoke that was not too acrid. Pine was never used. Its resin would ruin the flavor of the fish and make it bitter. The goal was not to cook the salmon, but to slowly dehydrate it while infusing it with the preservative chemicals present in the smoke. The smoke contained compounds like formaldehyde and phenols, which were powerful antibacterial and antifungal agents. They were scientists without a laboratory. Their knowledge was based on trial and error over thousands of years. For weeks, the longhouse was filled with a thick haze. The smell of alder smoke and drying fish was the scent of life, the scent of a safe winter. Alara would check the fish daily. She would feel the flesh, testing its dryness. The thin strips of the belly would dry first, becoming a hard, crispy treat for the children. The thicker back pieces took much longer. The process could take 3 weeks or more, depending on the size of the fish and the humidity. She knew the dangers. If the fire was too hot, the fish would cook on the outside but remain raw inside, where rot would begin. If the smoke was not dense enough, flies could lay their eggs in the flesh. If the fish was not dried completely, mold would grow on it during the damp winter months. A mistake meant hunger. One winter, when she was a girl, she remembered a whole cache of improperly smoked fish had to be thrown away. That winter had been hard. People had grown thin. The elders had told stories to distract the children from their empty bellies. She would not let that happen to her family. Once the salmon was fully smoked and dried, it was as hard as a board. It was called selkswai in her language. These strips of dried salmon were then packed tightly into cedar boxes and stored in a dry place. A single box could hold hundreds of pounds of fish. Properly smoked, it would last for more than a year. It was the staple of their winter diet. They would eat it as is, chewing on the hard strips, or they would break it into pieces and boil it with water and dried berries to make a thick, nourishing soup. It was also a vital trade good. Her village was known for the quality of its smoked salmon. They would trade it with people from the mountains for goat wool and obsidian for tools. They would trade it with people from the coast for yulachan oil, a rich grease that was an important source of fat. The smoked salmon connected them to a wider world. One afternoon, her young son came to her, his face serious. He held up a piece of salmon that had fallen from the rack. "Is it ready?" he asked. Alara took the fish. She broke a small piece off and handed it to him. He chewed it, his eyes wide. It was salty, smoky, and rich. It was the taste of home. It was a taste of survival. She looked up at the hundreds of red bodies hanging in the smoky dimness of the longhouse. And each one was a promise, a story the river had given them, a story they preserved in smoke to tell themselves through the cold, dark days of winter. Number 7, fermentation was a cure for a disease that didn't have a name. James O'Malley shivered, though it was not cold in the belly of the HMS Endeavour. He was a seaman, 22 years old, from Cork, Ireland. The year was 1769. The ship, under the command of Lieutenant James Cook, was charting the unknown coast of New Zealand. For months they had seen nothing but water, sky, and now this green, forbidding land. The shivering was not from fear. It was a weakness in his bones. His gums were sore. He bled when he chewed his daily ration of hardtack. Old scars on his arms had begun to ache and turn a strange purple color. He felt a profound lethargy, a weariness that sleep could not fix. He had seen this before on other voyages. He knew what it was called. The sailors called it the scurvy. It was the plague of the seas. On long voyages, it was not uncommon for half a ship's crew to die from it. But this voyage was different. Lieutenant Cook was a man obsessed with the health of his crew. He was a brilliant navigator and cartographer, but he was also a student of diet. Before they left Plymouth, he had loaded the ship with an unusual array of provisions. There were 7,860 pounds of a strange, pickled German cabbage called sauerkraut. Every day, the ship's cook would serve a pound of sauerkraut to each mess of 4 men. At first, the sailors had refused to eat it. It was sour, foreign stuff. They were Englishmen. They ate beef and biscuits. Cook was a strict but fair captain. He did not force them. He used psychology. He had the sauerkraut served on the officers' table every day. The officers ate it with gusto. Seeing their superiors enjoying the stuff, the common sailors assumed it must be a delicacy. They began to ask for it. Soon, it was a regular part of their diet. James had grown to like it. Its sharp, vinegary taste was a welcome relief from the endless salt beef and dry biscuits. He did not know why Cook insisted on it. The captain had theories about freshness in food. He also forced the men to eat onions and a thick fruit syrup called portable soup. When they landed, he sent foraging parties ashore to find anything green, like the wild celery and scurvy grass they found in New Zealand. James sat with his messmates eating his portion of salt pork and sauerkraut from a wooden bowl. An older sailor, a man named Jones, grumbled. I'd kill for a pint of ale and a plate of fresh greens from my wife's garden, he said. This cabbage will have to do, another sailor replied, scooping up a forkful. Better than the alternative. They all knew the alternative. They had heard the stories. A man's teeth would fall out. His joints would swell until he could not walk. His skin would break out in sores. In the final stages, he would suffer from internal bleeding and die in agony. It was a terrifying, mysterious disease. No one knew what caused it. Some thought it was bad water. Others blamed the salt air. What they didn't know, what no one in the world knew, was that scurvy was caused by a lack of a specific nutrient, what we now call vitamin C. The human body cannot produce it. Without a regular supply, the body's ability to produce collagen breaks down. Collagen is the glue that holds the body together. Without it, the body literally starts to fall apart. Sauerkraut, a simple dish of shredded cabbage fermented with salt, was rich in this life-saving vitamin. The fermentation process carried out by lactic acid bacteria not only preserved the cabbage for months or years, but also made the nutrients within it more available to the body. Now, it was an ancient preservation technique, but on Cook's ship, it was a revolutionary medicine. James's own symptoms, the sore gums and weariness, had started to fade after a few weeks of the strict diet. He felt stronger. He could climb the rigging without his joints aching. The ship's surgeon, William Perry, kept meticulous records. On the entire 3-year voyage of the Endeavour, which circumnavigated the globe, not a single man died of scurvy. It was an almost unbelievable achievement. In an age when ships were expected to lose dozens of men on any long voyage, Cook brought his crew home almost entirely intact. James O'Malley would never understand the science behind it. He just knew that he had been on the edge of a terrible death, and something had pulled him back. He attributed it to the captain's genius and strictness. The daily dose of sour cabbage had seemed like a strange command from a peculiar officer, but it had saved his life. He was alive because of a barrel of fermented cabbage. It was a simple food, a peasant's food from the fields of Germany, but in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, it was a miracle. Number 6, a Roman soldier's world was held together by vinegar. Lucius Caledius Fronto adjusted the heavy wool cloak over his shoulders. A persistent drizzle was falling. It was the year 125 AD. He was a legionary in the Legio the Sixth Victrix stationed at the fort of Vindolanda, a few miles south of the massive wall his legion was building across the north of Britain. This wall, Hadrian's Wall, was the edge of the world. Beyond it was the land of the Caledonians, a wild people who did not bow to the rule of Rome. Lucius was from Hispania, the south of modern Spain. He had grown up under a warm sun, surrounded by olive groves and vineyards. Britain was a cold, damp, gray place. He missed the food of home more than anything. The warm bread, the fresh figs, the grilled fish. Here, the food was monotonous and practical. It was fuel for the empire's military machine. His lunch was simple. A piece of hard bread, panis militaris, and a handful of something from the large clay amphora in the corner of the barracks. He scooped some out into his bowl. It was a mix of small onions, turnips, and olives, all swimming in a sharp, pungent brine of vinegar and salt. And pickled vegetables, this was a taste of his daily life. The Roman army was the best organized institution in the world. And its logistics were a marvel. An army of thousands of men, stationed on a remote frontier, had to be fed. While they foraged and requisitioned some food locally, the bulk of their diet was preserved and shipped from across the empire. Grain for bread and porridge was the staple, but a man could not march and fight on grain alone. Vinegar was as essential to the Roman legionary as his gladius, his short sword. Every soldier carried a small flask of pasca, a drink made of cheap, sour wine or vinegar mixed with water. It was safer to drink than local water, and it was surprisingly refreshing, but vinegar's most important role was as a preservative. The amphora in Lucius's barracks had traveled a long way. The olives were from his native Hispania. The onions might have been grown in Gaul. They had been harvested and placed in barrels or jars filled with a strong brine. The high acidity of the vinegar prevented the growth of molds and bacteria. It was a simple, effective technology that allowed the army to have a supply of vegetables year-round, even in a place like Britain where the growing season was short. Lucius chewed on a small, wrinkled olive. The sour, salty taste was powerful. It was not a delicacy. It was a necessity. The army's quartermasters understood on a practical level that a diet of only grain and salted meat led to sickness. The men needed more. These pickled foods provided essential nutrients and broke the monotony of the rations. They helped prevent the sicknesses of the sea and long campaigns that could cripple an army as effectively as any enemy. He remembered a long march the previous year, pursuing raiders north of the wall. For 2 weeks they had lived on what they could carry: hard bread, salted pork, and a bag of pickled onions. They marched 30 miles a day through bogs and over hills. The work was grueling. The pickled onions were a highlight of the day, their sharp taste cut through the greasy salt pork. They made the stale bread more palatable. The army's diet was systematic. Each man was allotted a specific amount of grain, salt, meat, and a sedum or sour wine for vinegar. Contracts were made with merchants across the empire to supply these goods. A recent delivery had brought in barrels of pickled fish from a port in Gaul. The smell was overpowering, but it was a welcome change. Lucius finished his meal and prepared for his watch duty on the fort's ramparts. He looked out over the bleak, rolling hills. It was a lonely posting. He had signed up for 25 years of service. If he survived, he would be granted a piece of land and Roman citizenship. That was the promise that kept him going. That and the reliable, if uninspired, food that arrived day after day. The Roman Empire was not just held together by roads, laws, and legions. It was held together by logistics, by the grain ships from Egypt, the salt from the mines of Dacia, and the countless amphorae of pickled goods that traveled to every corner of the empire. For a soldier like Lucius, a simple pickled olive was a link to that vast network. It was a taste of a sunnier place, preserved in vinegar, a small comfort at the cold, wet edge of the world. It was a piece of Roman technology that helped a Spanish soldier stay alive in Britain. Number 5, sugar was a medicine before it was a treat. And Jean-Pierre wiped his sticky fingers on his apron. He was an apprentice, just 14 years old, in a confectioner's shop in Paris. The year was 1555. The shop was a dark, narrow space that smelled of honey, spices, and the exotic, expensive substance that was the heart of the business, sugar. His master, Monsieur Dubois, was a stern man with a powdered wig. He was not just a candy maker. He was a craftsman, an artist, and something of an apothecary. In the 16th century, the line between confectioner and pharmacist was blurry. Sugar was considered a medicine, a preservative, and a status symbol all at once. Today's task was to make candied apricots. A shipment of fresh apricots had arrived from the south of France, a rare luxury. They had to be preserved. If they were left for a few days, they would rot. Monsieur Dubois would not tolerate such waste. The process was long and painstaking. First, Jean-Pierre had to carefully prick the skin of each apricot with a silver needle. This would allow the sugar syrup to penetrate the fruit. Then he prepared the syrup. This was the expensive part. Sugar, imported from plantations in the New World or the Mediterranean, cost a fortune. It was sold in hard cones and had to be scraped or pounded into a powder. A single cone of sugar could cost as much as a week's wages for a skilled laborer. He mixed the sugar with water in a large copper pot and heated it slowly. He had to watch it constantly. If it boiled too quickly, the sugar would caramelize and turn brown, ruining the delicate color of the apricots. He had to skim the impurities off the surface with a long-handled spoon. Monsieur Dubois watched him like a hawk. "Pathians, boy," he grumbled. "The sugar is a jealous mistress. Turn your back for a moment and she will betray you." Once the syrup was ready, the apricots were gently lowered into the pot. They were simmered for a short time, then removed and left to sit overnight. The next day, the syrup would be drained. More sugar would be added to it to increase its concentration, and it would be brought to a boil again before being poured back over the fruit. This process was repeated every day for a week, sometimes longer. Each day, the sugar concentration of the syrup increased. The process was a slow, gentle osmosis. The sugar molecules would enter the fruit, and the water molecules would leave. The high concentration of sugar in the fruit would create an environment where microorganisms could not survive. It was a form of controlled dehydration. The sugar was replacing the water, preserving the fruit's shape, color, and a version of its flavor, now magnified by intense sweetness. This was not food for common people. This was for the nobility, for the wealthy merchants, for the royal court of King Henry II. Catherine de' Medici, the Italian queen, had brought her taste for such delicacies to France. A box of candied fruits was a lavish gift, a way to display wealth and sophistication. The shop also made fruit pastes, jams, and jellies. The principle was the same. Fruit was cooked with a large amount of sugar, which acted as the preservative. These preserves, sealed in earthenware pots with a layer of wax, could last for months. Doctors would prescribe them. A confection was originally a medicinal preparation made with sugar. Sugar was believed to balance the body's humors. It was used to mask the taste of bitter medicines. A spoonful of rosehip jam was prescribed for a weak constitution. Jean-Pierre saw a wealthy woman enter the shop. She was dressed in silk and velvet. She was there to pick up an order for a banquet at her husband's chateau. The order included candied angelica, violets, and the very apricots Jean-Pierre was working on. The cost of the order was more than his father, a stonemason, earned in a year. He carefully lifted the now translucent apricots from the final syrup and placed them on a wire rack to dry. They glistened like jewels. The process had transformed them. A soft, perishable fruit had become a durable, intensely sweet confection. He knew that on the other side of the world, people were forced to labor under brutal conditions on sugar plantations to produce this luxury. He had heard sailors talking in the taverns, but here in Paris, it was just a white powder that arrived in ships, a magical substance that could stop time, cheat decay, and turn a simple fruit into a treasure fit for a queen. For him, a young apprentice, it was the key to a skilled trade, a way to escape a life of hard labor like his father's. He was learning the secrets of preservation by sugar, a sweet science that was a matter of life and death for the fruit, and a source of immense wealth for the men who mastered it. Number 4. The earth itself was the first refrigerator. Sarah Bishop pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The wind had a sharp edge to it. It was October of 1778. The leaves on the maples behind their small farmhouse in western Massachusetts had turned to brilliant shades of red and gold. It was a beautiful sight, but it was also a warning. Winter was coming. She stood at the edge of a deep pit her father and older brother had dug in the side of a small hill. It was about 10 feet deep and 6 feet square. They had lined the bottom and sides with stones to keep it from collapsing. This was their new root cellar, their old one. A simple hole under the kitchen floor was too small and damp. For the past week, the entire family had been working from sunrise to sunset, getting ready for the cold months. The harvest was in. The barn was filled with hay for their 2 cows. The corn had been husked and stored. Now, they had to preserve the vegetables that would see them through until spring. Survival depended on this work. The war with the British meant that some supplies were scarce. They had to rely on what they could grow themselves. Sarah, who was 12, had been helping her mother dig up the last of the potatoes and carrots. Her hands were sore and caked with dirt. They had harvested bushels of them. Now her brother was carrying them down a rickety ladder into the new cellar. He was layering them in bins filled with dry sand. The sand would keep the vegetables from touching each other, which would stop any rot from spreading. It would also help maintain a consistent moisture level, keeping them from shriveling. The root cellar was a simple but brilliant piece of engineering. It used the Earth's natural insulating properties. A few feet below the surface, the ground temperature remains relatively stable year-round, staying above freezing in the winter and cool in the summer. The cellar would keep the vegetables in a state of suspended animation. It was cold enough to slow down the natural processes of decay and sprouting, but not cold enough to freeze and destroy them. Next came the cabbages. Sarah had helped her mother wrap each head of cabbage in newspaper. Some they would turn into sauerkraut, but the rest they would store whole. Her father hung them upside down from the wooden beams that would form the ceiling of the cellar. Hanging them this way was supposed to help them last longer. They also stored apples, each one individually wrapped in paper and carefully placed on shelves, not touching. One bad apple really could spoil the whole bunch. A fungus or rot could spread quickly in the confined space. It was hard, tedious work, but Sarah knew its importance. She remembered a winter 2 years ago when a blight had ruined half their potato crop. By March, the food stores were dangerously low. They had been forced to eat a thin porridge made of ground corn day after day. Her younger sister had been sick for weeks. That memory was a powerful motivator. The cellar was more than just a food storage space. It was the family security. It was their bank account filled with the currency of calories. When the snow was 3 feet deep and the world outside was frozen solid, this dark, cool hole in the ground would be a treasure chest of food. Her father placed heavy wooden planks over the top of the pit, leaving a small insulated door for access. And then he shoveled a thick layer of dirt over the planks, followed by a pile of straw. The entrance was a small, low door on the side of the hill. That evening, sitting by the fire, her father read from the family Bible. Her mother was mending a tear in her brother's trousers. The house was filled with the smell of wood smoke and the apple pie her mother had baked as a treat for their hard work. Sarah felt a sense of deep satisfaction. The cellar was finished. The food was stored. They were ready. The practice of using the earth for preservation was ancient. People had been burying food in pits, caves, and clamps for thousands of years. In some places, they buried grain in underground pits to hide it from enemies and protect it from pests. The principle was the same, using the stable, cool temperature of the earth to fight against decay. For Sarah's family, it was not a matter of history. It was a matter of life. That winter, a blizzard buried their farm in snow for a week. They could not get to the barn. They huddled in the house, feeding the fire, grateful for the warmth. And every day her father would trudge through the snow to the little door on the hillside. He would return with potatoes, carrots, and a head of cabbage. They would eat a hearty stew. The food from the earth stored back in the earth was keeping them alive. Number 3, drowning meat in its own fat was a form of magic. Annette moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of a woman who had performed this ritual every autumn for 40 years. It was November 1821 in the Gascony region of southwestern France. The first true cold had arrived, bringing with it the time for the preservation of the geese. Her family's small farm depended on this. The rich, preserved goose meat would sustain them through the lean months of winter and spring. The process had begun weeks earlier with the gavage, the force feeding of the geese with maize to fatten their livers for foie gras. That was a delicacy, some of which would be sold in the market, but today was about preserving the meat itself. This was the art of comfort. Her husband and sons had slaughtered the geese at dawn. Now, the kitchen was a scene of organized butchery. Annette's domain was the large cast iron pot that sat over the hearth. The air was filled with the rich smell of rendering fat. She had spent the morning slowly melting down the thick layers of goose fat. The golden liquid that resulted was the key to everything. It was both the cooking medium and the preservative. The goose legs and wings had been curing for a full day. Annette had rubbed them generously with coarse salt, garlic, and thyme from her garden. The salt was crucial. It drew moisture out of the meat, which both concentrated its flavor and began the preservation process by making the flesh less hospitable to bacteria. Now, she carefully wiped the excess salt from each piece of meat and gently placed it into the pot of warm liquid fat. The fat was not boiling. That was the secret. Confit is not frying. It is a slow, gentle poaching. The temperature of the fat had to be kept low, around 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Annette knew the right temperature, not by a thermometer, but by the look of the small bubbles that would occasionally rise to the surface, by the soft, simmering sound. She would let the meat cook slowly in the fat for 2 to 3 hours. The low temperature would break down the tough connective tissues in the legs, making the meat incredibly tender so it fall from the bone. At the same time, the fat would form a protective barrier, preventing the meat from drying out. While the goose was cooking, she prepared the earthenware crocks. They had to be perfectly clean and dry. Any moisture, any contaminant, could ruin the entire batch. Her grandmother had taught her that cleanliness was the first rule of preservation. When the meat was cooked, she used a long-handled fork to lift each piece out of the pot, letting the excess fat drip back. She packed the pieces tightly into the crocks. Then she strained the remaining fat through a fine cheesecloth to remove any small bits of meat or herbs. These small particles could be a starting point for spoilage. The final and most critical step was to pour the warm, clarified fat over the meat in the crocks. She had to make sure the fat covered the meat completely, leaving no air pockets. The fat had to form a perfect, unbroken seal over the top, at least an inch thick. Once the fat cooled and solidified, it would create an airtight barrier. Oxygen is the friend of bacteria. By sealing the meat away from oxygen, the fat would protect it from decay for months. She would store the crocks in the coolest part of the house, the larder. Down there, the confit would slowly mature, the flavors would deepen. By January, when fresh meat was scarce, she would be able to go to the larder, break the seal of fat on a crock, and pull out a goose leg. She would then fry it in a little of its own fat until the skin was brown and crispy. It would be served with potatoes, also fried in the goose fat. It was a rich, hearty meal that tasted of more than just goose. It tasted of foresight, of hard work, of security. The word confit comes from the French verb confire, which means to preserve. The technique was ancient, a way of preserving meat, particularly pork and waterfowl, long before refrigeration. It was a method born of necessity in a world without freezers. A whole animal could be butchered and, through salt and fat, made to last through the winter. And Annette looked at the row of sealed crocks. It was a good year. 6 crocks full. That was enough for her family, with a little left over, to trade with the baker for bread or the vintner for wine. This was their wealth. It was not gold or silver. It was preserved food. The magic was simple. Fat repels water and blocks air. But for Annette, seeing those crocks filled with the promise of future meals, it felt like a powerful enchantment against the hunger and uncertainty of the coming winter. Number 2, the cold was a relentless enemy and a constant friend. Anya knelt on the snow-covered ground. The wind was a physical force pushing against her sealskin parka. She was focused on her work. Before her lay a freshly killed caribou brought down by her husband, Kalen, after a 2-day hunt. It was late autumn in a part of the world that would one day be called Nunavut, Canada. The year, by the reckoning of the southern people, might have been 1880. For Anya and her Inuit family, it was simply the season of preparation, the time before the long, dark winter. The caribou was a gift. It was meat for strength, fat for warmth and light, hide for clothing, and sinew for thread. Nothing would be wasted, but a single caribou was too much to eat before it spoiled even for her extended family. Preservation was not a choice. It was the central challenge of their existence. Anya worked quickly with her ulu, a crescent-shaped knife with a handle of bone. Her hands, though covered by mittens, were nimble and sure. She skinned the animal, carefully setting the hide aside. Then she began to butcher the meat. She cut it into large, manageable pieces. Some of it would be eaten fresh over the next few days. Some would be dried into thin strips called pipsy, but the bulk of the meat had a different fate. It would be frozen. Their freezer was not a machine, it was the land itself. Kalen had already prepared the cache, or inuksiswit. He had dug a pit in the permafrost, the permanently frozen ground that lay a foot or two beneath the thin layer of topsoil. This was brutally hard work, done with tools made of antler and stone. He had chipped away at the frozen earth for hours. The pit was about 4 feet deep. He had lined it with flat stones. Anya and her children carried the pieces of caribou to the pit. They placed the meat inside, packing it tightly. Once it was full, Kalen covered the meat with another layer of flat stones. On top of that, he built a cairn, a tall pile of rocks. The cairn had 2 purposes. It would mark the location of the cache so they could find it again, even after heavy snows. And it would protect the meat from scavengers like wolverines and Arctic foxes. In this natural freezer, the meat would be safe. The temperature of the permafrost was a constant, far below freezing. The meat would freeze solid in a matter of hours and stay that way until they needed it. It would not rot. It would not decay. They would have access to fresh meat throughout the long, dark winter. They had dozens of these caches scattered across their hunting territory, some containing caribou, others seal, or Arctic char. This method was thousands of years old. It was a perfect adaptation to their environment. They were using the very thing that made their lives so difficult, the intense, persistent cold, as their primary tool for survival. Later that winter, during a week-long blizzard, they were confined to their sod house. The wind howled outside. They could not hunt, but they did not go hungry. Kalen would venture out into the storm, navigating by memory in the shape of the snowdrifts to one of the nearby caches. He would pull away the top stones, dig through the snow, and retrieve a frozen haunch of caribou. Back in the house, Anya would shave thin, frozen slices of the meat with her ulu. They would eat it raw. This was quack, or frozen meat. Eaten this way was surprisingly tender and melted in the mouth. It also provided them with crucial vitamins and nutrients, like vitamin C, that would be destroyed by cooking. The Inuit did not suffer from scurvy, a fact that baffled early European explorers because so much of their meat was eaten raw or frozen. The cold was a constant presence. It shaped their bodies, their culture, their technology. It could kill a person in minutes if they were careless. But it also, gave them the gift of perfect preservation. Their food was not salted, smoked, or pickled. It was simply frozen, locked in time by the climate. Anya watched her youngest son chewing on a piece of quack. His cheeks were round and healthy. The cold that threatened to steal the life from them every day was the same force that guaranteed they would have food tomorrow. For Anya, this was the central paradox of her world. The cold was a relentless enemy, but it was also their most reliable friend. It was the silent, invisible guardian of their food and their future. Number 1, a glass bottle on a battlefield changed how the world eats. Pierre Dubois shivered, but it was not from the cold, it was from hunger. A deep, gnawing emptiness in his stomach had been his constant companion for weeks. It was the winter of 1812. He was a corporal in Napoleon's Grande Armée, and he was retreating from Moscow. It was a disaster. The army that had marched into Russia 600,000 strong was now a ragged column of ghosts, starving and freezing their way back west. The Russian winter and the scorched earth tactics of the enemy had destroyed them more effectively than any battle. The food was a fantasy. The men ate their horses. They ate boiled leather from their harnesses. They fought over scraps. Pierre had seen a man killed for a handful of filthy grain found in a burned-out barn. His small unit of a dozen men had been lucky. Their captain, a thoughtful man named Luke, had been a quartermaster before the invasion. He had a fascination with a new invention he had seen in Paris. A confectioner named Nicholas Appert had won a 12,000 franc prize offered by the French government for a new method of preserving food for the army and navy. Appert's method was strange. He sealed food in thick, wide-mouthed glass bottles like champagne bottles. He sealed them tightly with cork and wax, then boiled the bottles in water for a long time. Captain Luke had managed to secure 2 crates of Appert's provisions for his company before the campaign. Most had been consumed or lost in the chaos. But Luke had kept a small personal stash of 4 bottles, hoarding them for an emergency. This was that emergency. They had found shelter in a deserted peasant hut. They had a small fire going. Captain Luke produced the bottles from his pack. The other men looked at them with suspicion. They were heavy, sealed with thick green wax. One was labeled Buff, another Haircuts Verts green beans, and 2 were soap. With a knife, the captain carefully broke the wax seal and pried out the cork. There was a faint pop. He sniffed the contents, he spooned a little out. It was a thick beef stew. He poured it into their one communal pot to heat over the fire. He did the same with the beans and the soup. The men watched, their eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. Food that had been in a bottle for 6 months. It was unheard of. Food rotted. Everyone knew that. This had to be some kind of trick. It was probably poison. But the smell that began to fill the small hut was not of poison. It was the smell of real food. Rich beef, savory soup. It was a scent from another world, a world of warmth and kitchens and full bellies. Pierre felt tears well up in his eyes. They shared the food, each man getting a small but precious portion in his cup. Pierre savored every mouthful. The beef was soft, the beans were mushy, but they tasted of summer. It was the first real food he had eaten in over a month. It was more than just sustenance. It was a reminder of civilization. It was a shock of warmth and flavor in a world of ice and starvation. What Pierre and his comrades did not know was that they were taking part in a revolution. Nicholas Appert did not understand the science behind his discovery. He operated on the theory that heat, combined with the exclusion of air, halted the process of decomposition. He did not know about bacteria or microorganisms. Louis Pasteur's work on germ theory was still 50 years in the future. Appert had simply, through painstaking trial and error, invented canning. By boiling the sealed container, he was killing the bacteria inside, and the airtight seal prevented new bacteria from getting in. For the men in that hut, it was not science. It was a miracle. The small meal did not save them. Most of them would perish before they reached friendly territory. But for that one night, they were not starving animals. They were soldiers of France, eating a proper meal. The food gave them a flicker of strength, a moment of warmth, a brief respite from the horrifying reality of their situation. The idea, however, would outlive the men. Appert's canning process, later adapted to use tin-plated steel cans instead of fragile glass bottles, would transform the world. It would allow armies to campaign farther, navies to sail longer. It would make it possible to feed the growing cities of the Industrial Revolution with food from distant farms. It would change diets, economies, and the very nature of warfare and exploration. But for Pierre Dubois, huddled by a fire in the vast, frozen emptiness of Russia in 1812, it was much simpler. And it was a beef stew from a glass bottle, It was a taste of life in a landscape of death. It was a testament to a simple, powerful idea that food, if properly protected, could defy time and travel across a continent, arriving intact to feed a starving soldier on the worst night of his life.